listeners, what was the best gotcha moment you ever experienced? Story 1. I was representing a tenant in a landlord-tenant dispute. The landlord was claiming my client had caused thousands of dollars in damage to the apartment, but my client insisted that most of the issues existed before they moved in. The landlord even brought in photos to show the before condition of the apartment. I asked him when the photos were taken. He confidently said they were from right before my client moved in. So I asked the judge for permission to examine the metadata on the images. The landlord looked confused, but the judge allowed it. I plugged the images into my laptop, turned the screen around, and showed the court. These photos had been taken just 2 weeks before the hearing, not before my client moved in. The judge immediately dismissed the case, and the landlord was hit with sanctions for trying to commit fraud in court. My client walked away without owing a dime, and the landlord had to deal with his own mess. Story 2. I was defending a client in a minor traffic case where he was accused of running a red light. The officer testified that my client's vehicle was completely past the stop line when the light turned red. He was certain about this and gave detailed testimony. I asked him how he could be so sure. He confidently said he had a dash cam and that it captured the violation. I asked if we could see the footage. The prosecutor looked surprised. Clearly, they hadn't reviewed it. We played the footage in court, and it showed my client entering the intersection while the light was still yellow. The judge gave the officer a stern look and immediately dismissed the case. The prosecutor apologized to my client after. Story 3. I was defending a client in a contract dispute where the other party claimed my client had agreed to specific terms in an email. They presented printed out emails in court as evidence. Something felt off, so I asked them to forward me the original email chain in digital. They hesitated, but the judge compelled them to send it. When I received the actual email file, I checked the headers. It turned out that the key email had been altered. The original had very different wording, which didn't support their claim at all. The judge was furious. Not only was the case dismissed, but opposing counsel faced serious consequences for presenting fraudulent evidence. Story 4. I was handling a messy divorce case where my client's husband was refusing to disclose his full income. He claimed he was barely making ends meet, so he shouldn't have to pay much in alimony. During discovery, I requested his financial records, but they were suspiciously incomplete. So I did some digging and found his social media accounts. He had recently posted about a brand new luxury car and an expensive vacation to Europe. Even better, he bragged in a comment about pulling in 6 figures. I printed the posts and introduced them in court. The husband's face turned red as the judge looked over the evidence. His barely making ends meet argument crumbled instantly, and he was ordered to pay the fair amount of alimony. Story 5. A company sued my client, claiming he had stolen trade secrets and shared them with a competitor. Their key piece of evidence? A set of documents that allegedly proved he had accessed sensitive files after he left the company. My client swore he had never logged in after leaving. I requested the company's IT logs, and after a lot of resistance, they finally turned them over. What did we find? The timestamps showed that the so-called unauthorized logins happened weeks before my client even left the company, when he was still an employee and had every right to access them. I pointed this out in court, and the opposing attorney's face dropped. The case was dismissed, and my client walked away with his reputation intact. Story 6. I was defending a man accused of stealing a car from his workplace. The company claimed they had security footage proving he drove off with it. My client swore he had never even touched the car, but the prosecution was confident in their evidence. During discovery, they finally turned over the footage. I watched it closely and noticed something strange. The timestamp on the video was from 2 days after my client had already been arrested. I brought it up in court. The prosecutor stammered, flipping through their notes. The judge leaned forward and asked the company's lawyer if they had an explanation. They didn't. The case was immediately dismissed, and my client walked out a free man. The company ended up under investigation for falsifying evidence. Story 7. I was representing a woman in a workplace discrimination lawsuit. She had been fired under suspicious circumstances after announcing her pregnancy, and HR insisted it was due to performance issues. They even provided a series of emails where her boss allegedly complained about her work. Something didn't add up. My client had performance reviews that were stellar, until she told them she was pregnant. I requested metadata for those emails. HR resisted, but the judge forced them to hand it over. Turns out the emails had been altered. The original versions showed no complaints, only praise. Someone had gone in and edited the text to make it look like she was struggling at work. When I revealed this in court, the company's lawyer asked for a recess. 2 hours later, they came back with a massive settlement offer. My client accepted, and HR ended up facing serious legal trouble. Story 8. I was handling a medical malpractice case where a hospital claimed my client had suffered complications due to her own negligence after surgery. The hospital produced signed forms proving she had received all necessary post-op care instructions. The problem? My client didn't speak English. She had specifically requested documents in her native language and was assured she would get them. When I cross-examined the hospital's witness, a nurse, I casually asked if she remembered personally giving my client the documents. She confidently said yes. Then I pulled out a recording. My client had secretly recorded the conversation at discharge where she repeatedly asked for instructions in her language, and the nurse told her, "Just follow what you remember from the doctor." The hospital's case collapsed. They settled within days, and my client got the compensation she deserved. Story 9. I was defending a guy in a personal injury case. The plaintiff claimed my client had hit him with his car while speeding through a crosswalk. They had medical records, eyewitnesses, and even a damaged bike as evidence. My client insisted he had never been near that intersection on the day of the accident. Then I checked the police report and noticed something strange. The witness statements all described a red sedan. My client drove a blue pickup truck. I confronted the plaintiff in deposition and casually asked, "Are you sure it was my client's vehicle?" He hesitated but stuck to his story. Then I pulled out parking garage records that showed my client's truck had been parked at his job all day during the alleged accident. The plaintiff's lawyer went pale. The case was dropped, and my client walked away clean. Story 10. I was prosecuting a landlord who had been illegally evicting tenants. He was known for filing false complaints to push tenants out and jack up the rent. One case involved a single mother who had lived in her apartment for years. The landlord claimed she had abandoned the unit and changed the locks while she was at work. In court, the landlord confidently claimed he had mailed multiple eviction notices and even posted one on her door. He produced a photo of the posted notice. I looked at the photo carefully. Something was off. The shadows in the image didn't match the time of day when he claimed he took it. So, I asked for the original photo's metadata. Turns out, the picture had been taken the day after he had already locked the tenant out, meaning he had faked the eviction notice after the fact to cover his tracks. The judge was furious. The landlord was hit with a hefty fine and ordered to pay damages. Even better, the local housing authority launched a full investigation into his shady business practices. Story 11. I was defending a guy in a DUI case. The arresting officer testified that my client had been visibly intoxicated, slurring his words and stumbling when he got out of the car. The breathalyzer supposedly showed he was just over the legal limit. My client swore up and down he hadn't been drinking. So I started digging. We got the dash cam footage from the police car. And guess what? The footage showed my client calmly stepping out of the car, walking in a straight line, and speaking clearly. No slurring, no stumbling, none of what the officer had described. Then I checked the breathalyzer records. Turns out the machine hadn't been calibrated in months, which made its readings unreliable. I presented this to the judge, and the case was immediately dismissed. The officer looked humiliated. My client walked out a free man, and the police department had to review their testing procedures. Story 12. I was handling a contract dispute where a company was trying to sue my client for allegedly violating a non-compete agreement. They claimed my client had taken confidential company information and used it to start a competing business. Their key piece of evidence? An email supposedly written by my client discussing plans to steal clients and trade secrets. I asked to see the email's metadata. The opposing lawyer hesitated. When they finally turned it over, it showed something interesting. The email had been sent after my client's company had already been launched, meaning the plan to steal clients was actually just normal business outreach. The judge wasn't happy. The case was thrown out, and the company was warned against filing frivolous lawsuits in the future. My client's business was safe, and the opposing company walked away embarrassed. Story 13. I was representing a woman in a nasty divorce. Her soon-to-be ex-husband was claiming he had no money to pay spousal support. He submitted financial statements showing he was practically broke. I wasn't buying it. I had a hunch he was hiding money. So, I started checking his social media, and there it was. Pictures of him on a yacht, flashing expensive watches, and posing next to a brand new luxury car. Even better, he had posted a picture of a massive casino win. In the comments, a friend asked, "Dude, how much was it?" His reply? "200K, baby." I printed everything out and presented it in court. The judge asked him point blank if he had this money. He tried to stammer his way through an excuse, but it was too late. He was ordered to pay the full amount of spousal support, plus penalties for trying to hide assets. Story 14. A client of mine was being sued by a former employee who claimed she had been wrongfully fired due to discrimination. The employee had plenty of witnesses backing her story and even had email evidence that seemed to support her claims. But something felt off. My client had a strict, documented policy against discrimination, and the employee had actually been let go for repeated performance issues. Then I took a closer look at the email evidence. Something strange jumped out. The font was slightly different from the company's normal email template. I requested the original emails in digital format. The plaintiff's lawyer tried to refuse, but the judge ordered them to turn them over. Once I got them, I checked the metadata. Sure enough, the emails had been altered. The plaintiff had edited messages to make it look like she was being targeted when, in reality, she had been given multiple warnings about her poor performance. The case collapsed instantly. Not only was the lawsuit dismissed, but the plaintiff ended up facing legal trouble for submitting falsified evidence. Story 15. I once represented a man in a personal injury case. He had been hit by a car while jogging, but the driver's insurance company refused to pay, claiming my client had jumped in front of the car and was responsible for his own injuries. The driver had a dash cam and submitted footage that seemed to show my client suddenly appearing out of nowhere. The insurance company used this to deny the claim. But something seemed off. I requested the original dash cam footage, not just the short clip they submitted. The insurance company fought me on it, but the judge ordered them to release the full file. When we watched the full footage, we saw the driver was speeding and on his phone just seconds before the accident. Even worse, there was a section of missing frames right before the impact, meaning the video had been tampered. The judge was furious. The insurance company not only had to pay my client's medical bills, but also got hit with a hefty fine for trying to alter evidence. My client got justice, and the insurance company had to rethink their shady tactics. Story 16. I was representing a guy who was accused of vandalizing his neighbor's car. The neighbor had photos of the damage and even had a witness, his cousin, who claimed he saw my client do it. My client swore he was out of town that weekend. He even had receipts showing hotel stays, but the neighbor insisted the timestamps on the receipts were fake. I decided to dig a little deep. We subpoenaed security footage from the hotel where my client had stayed. Sure enough, the video clearly showed him checking in and walking through the lobby at the exact time he was supposedly smashing up this guy's car. I presented the footage in court. The judge turned to the neighbor and his cousin, who suddenly got very quiet. The case was dismissed immediately, and the neighbor was warned about perjury. My client walked away free, and the neighbor walked away embarrassed. Story 17. I was defending a woman accused of shoplifting from a high-end store. The store claimed they had surveillance footage showing her slipping expensive merchandise into her bag. I asked to review the footage myself. They hesitated, but eventually they handed it over. I watched the video carefully and something felt off. The timestamps were glitchy, and there was a weird skip in the footage right before the supposed theft. I requested the store's full surveillance logs, and they had no choice but to comply. That's when I found out the truth. The video had been edited. The original footage showed my client picking up an item, looking at it, and putting it back. The stolen items were never in her bag. The store manager turned pale when we presented the unedited footage in court. The case was immediately dismissed, and the store got slapped with a warning for tampering with evidence. Story 18. I was representing a small business owner in a case against his former business partner. The partner had claimed my client had stolen company funds and used them for personal expenses. He even provided financial records showing large withdrawals from the business account. My client was adamant that he never took a cent. I examined the bank statements carefully. Something didn't add up. The transactions happened on dates when my client was out of the country. We subpoenaed security footage from the bank where the withdrawals were made. The footage showed none other than the business partner himself making the withdrawals. I played the video in court. The partner turned red and tried to stammer out an excuse. The judge wasn't having it. The case was dismissed, and the partner was hit with fraud charges. Story 19. I was handling a child custody case where my client, a father, was accused by his ex-wife of being abusive. She claimed he had sent her threatening text messages and tried to break into her house. She had screenshots of the texts and a police report backing up her story. My client was devastated. He had never sent anything like that. I asked for the original messages from her phone. She refused. The judge ordered her to turn over her phone for forensic analysis. Turns out, she had used a spoofing app to send fake texts to herself from my client's number. When this was revealed in court, the judge immediately ruled in my client's favor. Not only did he get shared custody, but his ex-wife was warned that she could face criminal charges for falsifying evidence. Story 20. I was prosecuting a landlord who was trying to evict an elderly tenant illegally. The landlord claimed the tenant hadn't paid rent in months, and even showed forged documents proving he had given proper notice to vacate. The tenant swore she had been paying in cash, as she had done for years, and that the landlord was trying to push her out to raise the rent. I requested bank records and found something interesting. The landlord had been depositing cash in amounts almost identical to the tenant's rent right after she claimed to have paid each month. Then, I pulled his previous court records. He had done this before to other tenants. When I presented this in court, the landlord started sweating. The judge not only dismissed the eviction but also hit him with a fine. The tenant got to stay in her home and the landlord got a big lesson in why fraud doesn't pay. Story 21. I was defending a man accused of stealing from his workplace. The company claimed they had surveillance footage of him taking equipment after hours. They even had timestamps proving he was in the building when the theft occurred. My client swore he wasn't there that night. He had clocked out at 5 p.m. and gone straight home. I requested the full security footage, not just the clips they provided. They stalled, but the judge forced them to hand it over. When I reviewed the footage, I noticed something interesting. The timestamps on the clips they submitted were edited. In the raw footage, my client was seen leaving the building at 5:05 p.m. The actual theft happened almost 3 hours later, when someone else, wearing a similar outfit, came in through a side door. I presented this in court. The company's lawyer went pale, realizing they had been caught. The judge immediately dismissed the case, and my client walked free. The company, on the other hand, had to explain why they tried to frame an innocent employee. Story 22. I was representing a woman in a slip-and-fall case against a major grocery chain. She had slipped on a wet floor with no warning sign and suffered a serious injury. The store claimed they had posted signs and had a maintenance log proving the floor was dry just minutes before the fall. But something wasn't adding up. We requested security footage. The store dragged their feet, but eventually they handed it over. The video was suspiciously short, cutting off just before the incident. So I subpoenaed the store's full surveillance logs. That's when we found out the truth. The store manager had deleted the footage of the fall because it clearly showed that there was no warning sign and that the floor had been wet for over an hour without being cleaned. I brought this to court. The judge wasn't just angry, he was furious. The store was hit with a massive fine, and my client won a huge settlement. Story 23. A real estate company was suing my client, a contractor, for allegedly damaging a high-end apartment building during renovations. They claimed he had used substandard materials and left the place in shambles. They provided invoices showing my client had ordered and installed the wrong materials. But my client was meticulous. He kept every record. He showed me his actual invoices, which didn't match the ones submitted by the real estate company. We hired a forensic document examiner who confirmed the opposing side had forged the invoices. Even better, my client had emails from the supplier proving he had ordered the correct materials. When I revealed this in court, the judge immediately dismissed the case. The real estate company ended up getting sued for fraud, and my client's reputation was cleared. Story 24. I was defending a college student accused of plagiarism. His professor claimed he had copied an entire research paper and submitted it as his own. The school was threatening to expel him. My client swore he had written the paper himself. He even had handwritten drafts and notes to prove it. I asked the school for a copy of the original paper he supposedly copied. At first they refused, but I kept pushing until they handed it over. When I checked the document properties, I saw something shocking. The original paper had been created 2 weeks after my client submitted his. Turns out, another student had taken my client's paper, changed a few words, and turned it in later. The professor had assumed my client was the plagiarist without checking the submission dates. The school dropped the case immediately, and the real cheater was the one who ended up facing consequences. Story 25. I was handling a nasty inheritance dispute between two siblings. The brother claimed their late father had signed a will leaving everything to him, cutting out his sister completely. He produced a signed document dated just a few months before their father passed. The sister insisted their father would never have done that. Something seemed off. The father had been hospitalized at the time the will was allegedly signed. I requested his medical records and found out he had been physically incapable of signing anything on that date. Then, I had a handwriting expert examine the signature. It was forged. When I presented this in court, the brother turned ghost white. Not only was the will thrown out, but he ended up facing criminal charges for fraud. His sister got her rightful share of the inheritance, and justice was served. Story 26. I was defending a guy accused of causing a car accident. The other driver claimed my client had run a red light, causing a collision that totaled both vehicles. There was no dash cam footage, but the other driver had a witness who swore my client was at fault. My client insisted the light was green when he crossed the intersection. I requested traffic camera footage from the city, but they told me it had already been deleted. So I checked nearby businesses and found a gas station with a camera facing the intersection. We got the footage just in time. When we played it in court, it showed the other driver running the red light, clear as day. His witness? It was his cousin who had been following behind him and obviously lied. The case was immediately dismissed and the other driver ended up facing perjury charges. My client got an apology from the judge and walked out with a clean record. Story 27. I was representing a woman who had been fired from her job for poor performance. She insisted it was retaliation for reporting her boss for harassment. The company provided performance reviews showing she had consistently failed to meet expectations. But something didn't add up. Just a few months earlier, she had received an award for outstanding work. I requested the metadata for the performance review documents. The company refused, which made the judge suspicious. When they were finally forced to hand them over, we discovered the truth. The performance reviews had been altered just before the lawsuit. We also found an email from her boss, sent to HR saying, "We need to build a case against her before she causes trouble." When I presented this in court, the company folded immediately. They settled for a huge amount, and my client walked away with justice and a financial cushion to start over. Story 28. A man hired me after being sued by his neighbor, who claimed my client had destroyed his fence during a storm and refused to pay for repairs. The neighbor had photos showing the damage and receipts for a brand new fence. My client swore he had already fixed the fence himself before the lawsuit was even filed. I asked to see the neighbor's receipts. They were dated weeks after the supposed incident. That was odd. Then I requested his insurance claim records. Turns out the neighbor had already been paid by his insurance company for the damage, but still wanted my client to pay again. When I pointed this out in court, the neighbor quickly tried to drop the lawsuit. The judge wasn't having it. Not only was the case dismissed, but the judge referred the neighbor for insurance fraud.